And it's Ken Kraetzer for CBSI Services, talking business from my home office in White Plains, New York, and another episode of our Talking Business interview series, talking with leaders in the field of banking, insurance, customer service, business education, and representing our team in Harrison, New York, taking care of our customers in the banking industry, and what a great job they've done during the COVID-19, taking care of all of the customers, especially those who had travel challenges back in March, trying to get back from trips. And we always want to shout out to our team based in Harrison, New York. And today we're very pleased to talk with Tom Mariam, who is the CEO of Mariam Communications based in Rye Brook, New York. Tom, how are you today?
I'm good, or at least as good as anyone could be given the circumstances.
Yeah, it's been an amazing time. Fortunately, a lot of businesses are starting to open up here in the White Plains area. A lot of the restaurants are starting to open. Looking forward to when they can go back to full service, and some of the retail is starting to open up. How has the COVID-19 period been for you and your clients?
Well, I think the first thing that's obvious has been the relationship has become more distant physically, but that doesn't mean it's become more distant emotionally or psychologically or how you work with them. I think Zoom has been a tremendous asset to everyone, or the competitors to Zoom as well, not to exclusively put it on one company there, but the idea that you can see and talk to everyone from the convenience of your living room, your home office, kitchen. And it's interesting, I think we've seen a lot of that in people's personal lives behind them. And I think that's actually helped to bond people even further along the way. But that's been, one of the biggest things is that we've been able to continue on, particularly when you're in professional services businesses. You're in a physical business, you mentioned restaurants before. You can't serve a meal directly, through Zoom, of course. But, we've also found ways now to order and to pick up at doorsteps and so forth along the line. But I think what we're seeing now, like any of these major situations, some of them you can call crises, as this one is, and others less so, you're going to see some permanent changes. And I brought up an example. This is much lighter, but go back 40 years, New York City had a transit strike. So a lot of people had to walk very long distances to work, and it was particularly difficult for women who would go to work in heels back then. So some of the ladies decided to wear sneakers, at least as they were walking, and carry a pair of shoes or just leave it at their office desk. And then when they got in the office, put on their pumps or whatever and be in office attire. And, the subway strike ended a couple of weeks later, but that trend did not. And I remember about a year later, some friends of mine came in from Cincinnati, and my friend's wife said, "Why do all the women walk around the city in sneakers going to work?" And I explained that. So, nowadays you don't think twice about it. I think you see that common. So, I think the Zoom culture, if you will, is going to continue, and it's going to have a lot of ramifications as we move forward.
Sure. Now, you've had a long career in public relations, in working with the media, with law firms and professional services firms. It seemed like everybody had to stop on a dime around the 12th of March, that middle of March period, and reevaluate their communication strategy. In many cases, pull everything down that they had been running and developing media and messaging that would reflect the COVID-19 challenges. How is it for you and some of the clients and organizations that you work with?
I think the first thing, Ken, is sensitivity, is how you approach it. And we saw some firms that maybe they didn't intend it this way, but it certainly came across. They were taking advantage of making this a PR opportunity. And we've seen it more recently with the Black Lives Matters and the racial protests movement. So you have to come across as being sincere. And a lot of firms just rushed out and put out dozens of pieces of intellectual capital, whether they were articles or blogs or in some cases podcasts. And it got to the point that I read an interesting article in the American Lawyer by the end of March that the clients were saying, enough. And as we say, pass over Dianu. It was just so much was being thrown at them, and firms had to keep in mind that they weren't the only ones. Typical typical client has 3 or 4, maybe a half a dozen law firms, plus accounting firms and other consultants. So they were just getting overwhelmed by it. So I think it started to change the quantity into more of a focus on the quality that was being sent out. But it caught a lot of firms off guard. And I think those that were prepared for crises, and one of the keys to crisis management is not to think of exactly what the crisis would be, but how you would react. Those that were better prepared were in a better position to reach out to their clients and other key constituents.
Now, one of the situations so many organizations are facing, and marketing groups are conferences that were scheduled for the spring, and many have tried to shift online to do, as you said, different versions of conferences on Zoom or other video conferencing methods. And I know you ran a conference that you switched onto an online virtual version in May. Tell us a little bit about that, and what organizations should think about when they're transferring an event from a live event to a virtual one.
Sure. The one you're referring to, Ken, was the CMO Forum of the Legal Marketing Association. It's been an annual event here in New York where 3 or 4 chief marketing officers from a variety of law firms, not necessarily all the largest firms, but a good cross-section, and usually people with a lot of experience, and get a chance to talk about what's been going on in the profession and in the industry and what we can expect. And it was originally scheduled for March the 12th, which is pretty much when things came to a grinding halt. So a few days before that, it became obvious that an in-person event was just not a wise idea, much less being feasible. So it was postponed. And as a result, LMA, as it's known in brief here in New York, reconfigured the event as a Zoom conference back in late May. And we had 4 top CMOs on the panel, the same 4 that were scheduled to appear in person. And it worked well. 1 or 2 little technical glitches, but by and large, it became a very enlightening conversation. And it all focused on the COVID era, everything from how they're interacting with staff. And several of them said that they're much closer with their staff now. They get a chance to Zoom call. It breaks down barriers. One of them talked about that she has scheduled a lunch I don't know if it's every week or every month, doesn't really matter so much, where everybody will have lunch and they can just talk, and not necessarily about business, so that they still can unite the way they typically would in an office setting. And it also helps that with big firms, whether it be law firms or banks or whatever organization, we have people in multiple offices around the country, if not around the world. You can come together there. So those were some of the points that came out of the CMO forum. But to the larger idea that you brought up here, Ken, that I think people have to understand that not everything lends itself very well to a Zoom format. So the CMO forum, typically at one of the LMA meetings, is the first half hour is a combination of networking and grabbing your buffet lunch. And I think buffet lunches at events like this are going to be a vestige of the past. And then at 12:30 would come the substantive part. Obviously, we went right to the substantive area, but for the most part, it was listen to the panelists, and there was an opportunity to ask questions through the chat room, so people were included that way. That worked well, but on a larger scale, when you're talking about your typical industry conference, that's very difficult, because the main benefit to them, particularly when you're looking at a national organization, many of them have an annual conference, you're going to lose the aspect of networking, which is so critical. That's why so many people go to these, is to meet people and to meet them in person. You can't really do that in Zoom. You can't go up to someone and talk to them for 10 minutes or say, all right, maybe tonight we can have an after hours drink and talk a little business and become better acquainted. It's just not very feasible to have that. And that's on top of the fact that I don't know how many companies are willing to spend the money on travel, which is quite expensive, take the risk of mixing them with people from other parts of the country, other organizations, which of course increases the likelihood of spreading coronavirus. So those are going to have a very difficult time. A lot of them come with leisure activities. You'll notice a lot of them are held at resorts, so you can't have that golf tournament with your colleagues or go off for for a day or two as a side excursion, which a lot of these events encourage. A lot of times companies will do a side event. They'll have a cocktail reception for not the whole conference, but maybe a select group that they've invited, or sometimes they just say, you're welcome to join us. And those types of things I think are very hard to duplicate, and I don't think you're going to be able to do it. A more targeted forum, such as the CMO forum I mentioned, where you have a panel and a particular discussion, those translate better. It's still not as ideal as being there in person, but as the old commercial for the phone company was, it's the next best thing to being there.
Well, I think this whole idea of video communications is going to go through a review now that we've had 3 months of this new experience communicating video conferencing. Online education had to change as well, going through an evaluation for what works, what didn't work. When communications professionals kind of look back at this period, what will they say worked as far as communication? What were some of the things that didn't work? And is there an evolution to kind of a new normal in terms of communication?
I think what's worked is the video format. Again, I'm using Zoom as an overall name for the concept, even though it's a specific brand here. But I think we're going to see a lot more of that. There's a lot more comfort to having, because you see people directly and you can talk to them, so that changes it even from what a phone conversation was. But in my career, I've managed dozens of people who were not in my office and would do it by phone and by email. We didn't really use Zoom very much, but now that that's become prevalent, and I think most importantly, trusted. There was a lot of people who are very skeptical about it. So I think that that's one thing we're going to see adopted in a major way as we move forward. I think that I think it's going to depend on the individual experience as to what worked and what didn't. One of the key things is being flexible, to understand that what we had been doing has to change in some ways radically, some ways maybe not so much. But I think that that's a very important thing, is to take a look and see how your organization adapted, what they can do differently, and then we'll have to see moving forward what that means. And I think it's more effective internally this way. I think when you start reaching outside, particularly if you're in a business where you're looking at clients and customers, that might be a little bit trickier than the internal organization. But that's certainly one thing. Another was to be very relevant with what you're putting out to your client base, your customer base. I mentioned before how firms were just throwing every idea they possibly could relating to COVID-19 out there. And I think a sub-message here too is that being first and fastest isn't necessarily being best. There was so much unknown about COVID back in March. We know a lot more now, that it's sometimes better just to take a step back and wait a little bit and improve upon it, rather than necessarily being the first one out there. First isn't necessarily best or most accurate.
Now, Tom, you work in professional services, public relations, and also with law firms. Not so different from what CBSI works at in the banking industry and consumer payments field. Are there particular ways of handling public relations when you work for major financial service brands or law firms that's different from how public relations might be done for other industries?
The biggest one, I think, is the fact that you tend to, in the professional services, and if you're looking at banking on a corporate level, really it's B2B. You're looking more business to business, as opposed to a lot of other PR that you're looking more directly at the consumer, at the individual there. So that's an important distinction that comes right there. As I mentioned before, the idea of coming out with thought leadership on taking COVID here, it's important to really come across with something that's substantive. I think that makes a big difference to people. One of the things we saw recently was the last couple of weeks I've gotten, and I'm sure you have, and anybody watching this has, dozens of emails from any organization they ever dealt with talking about race relations. But so much of it was A, I thought a little late, but even more importantly, B, really empty. It was just a lot of words. They said the right thing. It wasn't that they said anything wrong, but you needed to add substance. And there was one organization that I got an email from, and they had the usual 1 or 2 lines, but then they went into a couple of really substantive programs that they are hosting coming up in the next few weeks, through late June and then again in July, to address the situation. But rather than just to say we're going to do better, that sounds hollow. And by what measure is better? And so I think it really makes a difference to be substantive. And the other thing is you can't forget your history. I think a prime example, Ken, is that the NFL. All of a sudden, they've come out and seen the light. Roger Goodell put out that great statement. Well, where were you 3 years ago when Colin Kaepernick couldn't, get a chance to throw a football in a training camp, and all the controversy over the kneeing, and all of a sudden you're coming all right behind the players and just forgetting the past? They're doing it because I think they see now that that's where the NFL fans are, and a lot of the sponsors are looking at, and they're trying to dig themselves out of a hole. But if you look, I talked about sincerity. If you look closely at Roger Goodell's video, which is now about 2 weeks old from the time we're recording this, he's looking straight. You can tell he's looking straight at the words that are up there for him. He's reading either off a teleprompter or something that was put up on a wall. You just look at his eyes. They're not looking at the camera. They don't have the sincerity that you really need to have when you're delivering a message like that, particularly when you're in such a senior leadership position. And so sincerity takes various forms. It's not just the words you've written or the words you say, but how it comes across to people.
Well, I guess you're pointing at this situation after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the protests and reevaluation of a lot of communities about how they've handled race relations over the decades, really, and history, as you said. A lot of it is not just pointing externally; it's pointing internally to what are some of the suggestions you have about how companies should look at the situation, both in terms of communicating with their employees and also with their customers and communities they operate in?
Well, the first thing is collaboration. This can't be done just at the CEO's level. It can't be done just by HR. It can't just be done by PR. Everybody, who's in a major role at the firm and representing all angles has to look at it, because a lot of these issues are complex, and particularly when we talk about the racial issue there, it's very different perhaps from working inside a firm to what the client base is. We talk about diversity at different levels, different departments. So, for instance, your overall numbers could be up there in terms of the percentage of minorities that you have working for you, but what types of positions are they? What types of leadership spots are they in? Where are you recruiting? It all starts with substance. PR without substance behind it is pretty empty. So it's really important that you have that. And if your organization isn't there, and I guess most have a way to go. I think where they vary is how much of a distance they have, and there is no finish line here. It's a continuum. It's where you have to adjust, but again, you have to be sincere about it. And you just promote people for the sake of making it look better with numbers. That's not very substantive either. It digs very deep in there, but it has to be a collaborative effort, and it's a long-term thing too, because you can window dress anything, and another year and a half or so, we'll be on to whatever the next issue is. And that's not right. If there's going to be any meaning here and any progress that occurred, it's going to have to be something that's really long-lasting.
And Tom, Mariam, you've got another aspect to your career, and that's working in professional sports and broadcasting. Long time that you did a show on WVOX, where I also do a show, and worked at Columbia in University in their athletic department. Certainly a big challenge for professional sports. Can they operate just by doing online television, no spectators? And what's the challenge? What do you see for spectator sports? You mentioned that this would have been the week of the U.S. Open in Mamaroneck at Winged Foot, but lots of changes. What do you see happening in professional sports and broadcasting and reopening?
Again, it's a very complex issue, and because this is a big country and with various degrees and various jurisdictions, some parts of the country don't seem to have a problem with having larger gatherings. So, can they have fans there? Legally they probably could. Should they? I don't know. Other areas it's still very restricted. But I think you have to peel it back step by step. The first thing is ensuring that the players can be in an environment that's safe. And the NBA is grappling with it now. They have this idea of the Orlando bubble, where everyone's going to be down in Atlanta. But it's not a pure system. Number one, they're not policing it to the point that you can't leave the complex. And we know young athletes, young men in their 20s are going to get tired of being in one place, and you know, they'll get around as much as they can, particularly in Florida where so many things are open. So that's a problem there. They're going to have people who service them who go from outside the bubble, you know, whether it's at the hotel that they're staying at or at the arenas they'll be working at it and eventually playing. So that's a problem there to keep it pure. The NHL's trying in over 2 cities, one of which is Las Vegas. Good luck in keeping everybody indoors in Las Vegas, particularly in the summer. And it's going to be a situation, you know, baseball is planning to use the stadiums. And I don't know what's the point of playing in front of an empty Yankee Stadium, but let's say down in Texas, they allow people to come in. And is that fair that the Rangers and the Astros could play in front of fans there? And what's the point of traveling? If you're going to have empty stadiums, why not use the spring training facilities? That would certainly facilitate things in terms of less travel. It would be somewhat similar to the NBA. You know, there's going to be risk there, but you know, the NBA has acknowledged that coaches who are in their 60s and beyond, you know, some really established coaches, the Greg Popoviches and Mike D'Antonis, may not be able to coach on the sidelines. That's something that they're looking at. So I think, you know, there's so many issues. And then with the broadcasting, and this is something that I could see turning into long-term permanency, at least in a number of markets. The idea of having broadcasters on the scene, you know, maybe you'll have the home team announcers there because it won't involve as much travel, but again, they still have to go to and from the stadium or arena and mix with their families and whatever. You know, I can't see road teams coming, bringing their crews there, whether it's the production crew or the actual announcers. And, you know, broadcasters are going to look at it and say, well, that's a nice savings. We'll have our broadcasters sit in the studio, or even at home now, and they can broadcast. They'll see the video just like anyone else. And you know, half the time anyway, especially in television, at least their broadcasters are looking at the monitor rather than what's on the field in front of them. So in some ways, it's not all that different for them. You can always pump a crowd mic in there and get the crowd noise if and when there ever are fans, or we've heard in some cases they're actually thinking of piping in canned crowd noise, which is interesting because one thing about fans is they're unpredictable in their reactions to things. And you know, how do you boo a player? When is it fair to put the boos on?
Yeah.
As well? So, you know, it's very complicated. The NFL has been acting for the most part like there is no coronavirus going on. You know, they went ahead with their draft schedule. They went ahead with free agency as scheduled. They put the schedule out for the 2020 season, not really admitting that they have any contingencies in there, though, you know, people who dissect the schedule could see that there are a few opportunities there to play around with it in the early part of it. They even announced yesterday they're going to put the Pro Bowl in Las Vegas. If there's ever an event that should be skipped, it has to be the NFL Pro Bowl. And putting it in Vegas, really, where you get people from all over the world coming, and the susceptibility, particularly with indoor hotels and people gathered around the craps table or poker table, that one I really question. So, and even Dr. Fauci said that football itself, just by the fact the line of scrimmage, you're so close to one another. Well, they require face shields to reduce the direct effect of the breath. You know, some of the most classic NFL films you see are the cold weather games from Green Bay or the old days of Minnesota. You see the breath going there. Well, that breath contains a lot of things in it, and these days it may contain the corona germ.
Well, I think the opening of the NFL preseason in mid-August is going to be telling whether they make plans to have spectators there or not, and that's going to affect what the colleges are able to do. I think that's standard when they open up around Labor Day weekend, and everyone is really looking very carefully at that. Certainly huge financial implications for everyone about whether spectators can be at these games or not. Tom, Mariam, I'd like to have you just tell us a little bit about some of the special services and focus of your practice in public relations.
Sure. I mean, it starts with communication strategy, and we talked about it a couple points here along the ways to have a strategy that fits your organization, that knows whom you're trying to reach, what you're trying to communicate. So that's the first thing, and sitting down with the clients and discussing with them what their strategic goals are, and then to work a plan to execute it. And that's another part, is being able to execute it. You know, public relations these days goes a lot further than it did when I first started out in the business. We talked about media relations, and even back then when I started, it was primarily print publications, newspapers, magazines. TV was a bit of an afterthought, radio too. And now, of course, we've gone on to online with websites and with blogs and posting on social media, podcasts, your own videos. So, a lot of different avenues that I help clients execute and create a policy, and we call it content creation policy, where if you come out with some content to make the most of it. It's in fact, I'm doing a webinar that should be out in the next week or so on what I call the Thanksgiving turkey approach to marketing and communications, which is, Thanksgiving, you cook one turkey and you're going to get about 4, 5, 6 meals out of it, right? You're going to get leftover turkey one day, you'll get turkey sandwiches, you'll probably have a turkey soup, figure out making maybe turkey tetrazzini and so on. But you've made that one effort to cook the turkey, as hard as it was, so you're going to gain quite a few meals out of it. And the same thing here is you come up with one idea, whatever the concept is, and to really take that and then turn it around in many different ways, whether you can release it through a combination of, whether you write your own articles, whether it's published in a third party, such as a magazine or an op-ed type piece, and blogs and social media and podcasts and videos and webinars now, which have obviously become much more important, speaking engagements, which we'll have in some form or another moving down the line. And there are plenty of different ways that you can communicate the same basic message and reach a wider audience, or reinforce it with the same audience by coming across in several different ways. So that's another thing too that I work with a lot with clients. And then my broadcasting experience, certainly, to do a number of podcasts with and for clients to fit them. And very often we do it as the course of a series. So again, you take one subject and you can break it down to 3 or 4 parts. We're all now used to binge watching through the pandemic. Perhaps that's another lasting element that we'll see and it's the same thing. You put out a series of podcasts, people can listen to them piecemeal, or they can binge listen, or if it's videos, binge watch over the course of a day or two. And particularly if you keep them brief enough, say 15, 20 minutes, it doesn't take much to get 10 of those across.
Yeah, that's certainly video is something we like doing in our CBSI Talking Business interview series. It's been a great way to reach out for people, tell their story, and gain expertise from top professionals like yourself. Tom, do you have a final thought for us? Things that businesses should be thinking about as they're trying to reopen over the coming weeks and months?
I think businesses should be thinking about being careful here. Number one, it's not a race, and that's one of the first things, is to do it right, rather than just come out and be first and be fast. And number two is to be flexible. I think that's one of the things that we've learned here. We talked about turning on a dime at the beginning of this, that who knows what's next. Maybe there is that second wave and that shuts things down even further and for a more extended period of time. And 3, I go back to being sincere. Being sincere in all the actions you take, because ultimately when it comes to communications, I think people can see very clearly who is sincere about what they're doing and what they're saying, and those who are not. And that goes a long way towards establishing your credibility and your authority.
Absolutely. Tom Mariam, CEO of Rye Brook, New York-based Mariam Communications, long career in public relations, media management for professional service firms, former broadcaster at Columbia University and a colleague on WVOX. Great to see you today, and really thank you for joining us.
Ken, it's a pleasure, and you be well, and everybody watching this be well.
Thank you, you too. And again, this is Ken Kraetzer for our team at CBSI Services based in Harrison, New York, providing insurance-based benefits to the credit card and consumer payments industry. Our team does a great job managing for our clients, customer service, and taking care of their customers all through this COVID-19 pandemic. And I always like to shout out to them. And again, this is Ken Kraetzer. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day, and stay safe, everybody.